Thank you for joining me today. My name's Nathan Garner. I'm the project manager and one of the tech support team leaders here at Dynamic CCTV. This is the first webinar of 2021, so thank you for taking the time to join today. We're going to be taking a look at the Hikvision IP range and some of the benefits of using IP surveillance as opposed to maybe the TVI range as such, and also some of the different things that you can do with the IP range of systems, whether or not it be the ANR functionality with IP cameras, and some of the more smarter analytics that you can do with the IP systems. I've also got some demos to go through after the webinar slides, because I don't want to bore everyone going through lots and lots of slide decks. So there's a few slides that I've got to go through with some demo videos for some of the newer ranges, the AccuSense and the 𝐂𝐨𝐫𝐸 ranges. And then we'll get straight on to looking at some of the web front ends of the units and doing some demos as well that we've got lined up for this one. So what is an actual IP camera? So IP stands for Internet Protocol, but most commonly referred to as an IP camera. What this means is that the actual cameras can either sit on a network, which would be a local area network, but that can also be accessible just locally, or you can access it remotely as well via the internet, depending on how your system's set up. You can create your own segregated network, so it's only ever available locally via your computer or other devices that are on that network, or you can make it accessible to the wider internet, which would be your WAN networks, where you could actually connect to that camera remotely from anywhere in the world, depending on how you want the system set up or the needs that to actually meet the site that the cameras are installed on. As opposed to TVI cameras send the video signal down coax or Cat5 if you're using balance. With an IP camera, it encodes the video directly in the cameras using the processing capabilities of the camera itself. That is then sent as data transmission over your network, which would be your data cables, which are connected to the actual camera. So instead of having the actual recorder doing the encoding before it's written to the disk, the camera itself with the IP systems actually encodes the video and then transmits it across the network as data packets. This helps when you've got a site that's more susceptible to video interference, whether or not it be high voltage lines that could affect standard TVI cameras with standard transmission. IP transmission is less susceptible to that, because it is actually data transmission, not video as such that's going down the cable. And with the IP cameras, they're accessible via an IP address. IP address is basically kind of works like your home address. So it's an address that you go to that is the camera. So it's the camera's IP address, but it's like a virtual address as such, which works similar. And so you'd put that into your web browser or even via IVMS 4200, and that allows you to actually be able to connect to the camera. And if it's connected to an MVI, would also use that address as well. So it's the actual physical address of the IP camera that's on the system. So what are the kind of benefits when it comes to Hikvision IP cameras? So across the range, generally they're powered via PoE, which you'd use either the PoE ports that are on the back of the recorders or individually using switches, depending on the size of the system or what's needed for the actual site. Would depend on whether or not you go for PoE switches that are sat across the network, that are then routed back to the NVR itself, or whether or not you can actually plug them directly into the back of the recorder itself. Some of the larger cameras, they still require a PSU, but a lot of them now are using the newer BT PoE, and that would allow you to get up to 90 watts of PoE for the power draw, so you're not having to use a PSU for the cameras for general use. There is still a couple that do require PSUs, but predominantly now most of the Hikvision range is available to power via PoE, which means it's a lot simpler on installation. You've only got one cable going to the camera, and it's then powered via a PoE switch or a PoE injector instead of having to wire a PSU locally to the actual camera itself. There's also the newer 𝐂𝐂𝐓𝐕 IP camera range. So these are the alarm filtering algorithms from Hikvision, which helps with false alarms on the likes of intrusion detection, line crossing, and there's now also motion 2.0. And that allows you to filter out false alarms such as animals, bushes in the camera image, and it prevents those from stopping, triggering the actual cameras. And these work at around 70 to 80% accuracy. Now there is a TVI range that's available, the TVI DVRs. There's an 𝐂𝐂𝐓𝐕 range available in them, but there are limitations when it comes to the TVI side of things. So on an 𝐂𝐂𝐓𝐕 TVI recorder, because it's the actual DVR that's doing the work, they're limited to only 4 channels of 𝐂𝐂𝐓𝐕 analytics, whereas the IP cameras, the analytics are done on the cameras themselves. So long as the camera has 𝐂𝐂𝐓𝐕 technology, you can enable that alarm filtering function, and you could do that across all the channels that are on the MVR itself, because it's the actual camera that's doing the analytics, not the recorder. That changes a bit when it comes to deep in mind MVRs, but we will be covering that on another webinar for the deep in mind range, which is separate to this. The other benefits with the IP cameras is you can achieve higher frame rates, higher resolutions. So on the 4K cameras, you're generally limited to 12 frames a second on TVI recorders, just as a limitation of the hardware itself. Whereas IP cameras, because the cameras are encoding the actual video, you can get up to 25 frames a second at full 4K resolution. Obviously, there can be some downsides to that, depending on the network capabilities on site, which we are going to cover. We're going to take a look at the Hikvision network bandwidth calculator and storage calculator a bit later down the line. You can also have multiple camera streams from an IP camera. So in the days of the analog recorders, and there's still a TVI recorder that's available currently, if you wanted to have another recorder in a separate location, you'd have to, with the physical connections with TVI and analog technology, you'd wire your cameras into the back of your first recorder, and they'd have a loop output which would repeat those camera signals, and you'd take another set of cables to your second DVR, which is in another location. With the IP systems, what you can do is you can actually add that IP camera to 2 MVRs at the same time. Now, so long as they're connected to the same network, you can just actually add the camera to both MVRs, so long as you ensure that the time and day is set exactly the same on both MVRs. If it's different, then you could get issue where the times jump on the actual camera's OSD display. Which makes it a lot easier than you would with TVI recorders, where you have to physically wire everything back to one recorder and then physically wire it to another recorder. Whereas with an IP system, you could have switches dotted all over your network or your building, and so long as they're connected to the same network that your recorder's going to be on, you can just add those via their IP addresses that they have on the actual network itself. With the newer ranges of cameras as well, you can now have the ability on the physical camera, where it has alarm input and outputs, that you can physically wire to the camera itself, and that can transmit the actual information down the same Cat5 cable back to the NVR via the network, which makes it a lot easier than having to wire all of your physical detectors back to the alarm inputs on the back of a recorder. There's also the ability on specific models of cameras to have a separate audio input wire to them. So if you have a scenario where you need to be able to have audio recorded at the actual camera location, you can set up a microphone locally to the actual camera, wire that into the audio output on the camera, input on the camera itself, and you can actually set the NVR to record the audio from the camera. You can also do the same thing with the audio outputs. So if you had a camera, say, in a warehouse, and you want to be able to speak out if someone's detected in that warehouse building, but you don't want to speak out across a full tannoy system, you could wire a speaker just to that audio output on the camera, and through either the HikConnect app or the VMS platform software such as iVMS and HikCentral, you would then be able to actually speak out of that speaker that's wired to the camera. So you can speak out to that specific location. You don't have to broadcast it across the full site. So it gives you more flexibility with those kind of systems as well from those. So some of the newer ranges that have recently been released, one of them being the fisheye cameras. So the standard fisheye camera, what you used to get is towards they're usually mounted on a ceiling. When you used to get towards the top of the actual ceiling, you used to get distortion around the camera lens. The newer versions of the fisheye cameras now have the Immervision Lens, which improves that and actually gives you a greater field of view and prevents a lot of that distortion that you used to have with the original range of fisheye cameras. These now also have three-way IR lights, which you can actually adjust individually. So if one area is too bright on a night when the IRs kick in, you can actually adjust that separately. You don't have to adjust it for the entire camera image. It can be for that one IR LED on the camera itself. And there's also more advanced functions with the fisheye cameras. So a lot of people generally use this for overall surveillance and surveillance for a room as an actual overview camera. But what you can actually do is if you use it in the likes of shops, shopping centres, or anything like that, what you can do is use the heat mapping functionality. So this will allow you to actually see the areas within the image that are most popular, or the higher trafficked areas. So this slide kind of shows it better with the actual camera. So you can see on the right hand side there, you can see the most popular areas as the colours get darker within the actual heat mapping section of the camera itself, which you can see there. So you can see the higher trafficked area in red, and you can see the kind of path that people have been taken with the actual fisheye cameras. And this is deep learning technology now, so it will, to the best of its ability, filter out animals, lights from triggering it, and general objects that could trigger false alerts with standard heat mapping on these cameras. And this just shows you the actual Immervision lens itself. So you can see on the right hand side, this was the original lens for the fisheye cameras. You can see that it's slightly distorted on the wheel there, which you can see is blown up there. On the new Immervision lens, so the blue outline there is where the old lens used to end. So now that's with the Immervision lens, that's actually been extended to a larger lens size. So you get more actual in your camera image, and it prevents those distortions or limits them as such on the new Immervision lenses with the cameras. So it makes them a lot more usable in specific scenarios with those as they come through. We now also have the AccuSense IP cameras. So these are your alarm filtering algorithms. So if you use line crossing, intrusion detection, and the new Motion 2.0, if you've ever used standard line crossing or intrusion detection in the past, you know, when you get the notifications through, you'll see a cat walking past the camera, a leaf blowing through, even rain, snow triggering the actual event. With the new AccuSense technology, the camera is actively filtering those events out, so you can set it to only trigger on human and or vehicle, and this will work up to 70 to 80% accuracy at filtering out those false alarms. So the more reliable when you're actually getting the event through or the recordings triggered, there is actually your target choice that's triggering the actual camera on site. So it gets rid of those nuisance false alarms or reduces them, should I say, much better than it would be with your standard VCA rules, which is greatly improved over the original version 1 of the 𝐂𝐂𝐓𝐕 technology. And this is the newer 2.0, which is now available on the new range, Gen 2 range of 𝐂𝐂𝐓𝐕 cameras. So that used to be where you could only use 𝐂𝐂𝐓𝐕 technology on line crossing and intrusion detection. However, now Hikvision have brought it into the motion detection. So you can actually set your target classifications, whether that be human and or vehicle. And that gets rid of a lot of the nuisance trips, as well as freeing up space, especially if you're using motion record on a NVR. It'll actually reduce the amount of storage that you're using on the system. So it will only trigger as often when it's a human or a vehicle that's actually being seen by the camera in the area that you've set up the motion with the system itself. And I do have a slide that just shows the 𝐂𝐂𝐓𝐕 technology as it works on the system. So with that camera there, that was one of the 𝐂𝐂𝐓𝐕 cameras, but that also had the built-in audio alert and white light, which is a flashing light which will trigger or can be configured to trigger if that line crossing or intrusion detection zone has been triggered by either a human and or a vehicle, which makes it a lot more reliable. You wouldn't want to be using standard line crossing intrusion detection when you're going to be wanting to trigger a siren, because it would be going off if you had a really bad rainstorm. It would be going off all night when it was raining. I'm sure a lot of people that live close to the site would be very annoyed with the constant triggers of the siren going off and the flashing lights from the building itself. So that's why that kind of came into the 𝐂𝐂𝐓𝐕 technology side of things, and not your standard kind of basic VCA events on the cameras themselves. They've also brought out a range of 4K colour view cameras, which I know a lot of people have been asking for a while now. And with the 4K colour views, you get the benefits of being in full colour day and night, as well as the higher resolution images, which gives you the more definition when you're digitally zooming a camera image. And I thought it'd be best to show a demo video of the colour view camera, so you can see the best possible images of it at night when you're actually using the cameras themselves. And these have been really popular at the moment. So that's just a quick video showing the differences between your standard cameras and the colour view cameras. The benefits being with the IP range, that there's now the 4K colour view cameras in the actual IP range, so you're getting the improvements with the higher resolution, as well as the new colour view technology as well for true day-night images, which are in colour all the time with the cameras. So if we take a look at the actual NVRs, so there's two kind of main ranges when it comes to IP NVRs. So you've got the K series NVRs and there's also the I series. The K series NVRs, they're generally designed for smaller installs, so your home installs and small businesses where you're not needing a large camera system on site. These now have a new firmware on them that's called EUI 4, which gives you a simpler user interface, so it makes it easier for end users. They're actually using the local menu control on the NVRs themselves. These units also have PoE ports on the back of the units, so predominantly used in a plug and play method. So you'd have your Cat5 cable from your IP camera, and that would connect straight into the PoE port on the back of the recorder. The NVR itself would then activate that camera with the admin password and also give it an IP address where the camera can see that on the PoE ports on the recorders, which would be within the 192.168.254.1 and above IP range. The recorder's physical PoE port on the back would be 254.1 for the recorder's address, and the cameras would be 254.2, 3, 4, and onwards. When they're plugged straight in the PoE ports. And this makes it a lot easier for smaller installs. So it works in a plug and play kind of scenario where you just basically plug in the IP cameras in the back of the recorder, and the actual NVR itself would activate them, give them an IP address, and automatically add them to the NVR itself. So it works a lot similar to the TVI recorders, where once the cameras are powered up, they're on the actual DVR. It's a similar kind of way that the NVRs work, where the recorder actually handles the handshake between the camera and the NVR. So it makes it a lot easier to set up for smaller installs using IP cameras. There isn't a need to go in and manually configure those IP cameras with IP addresses for smaller installs if they're plugging directly into the PoE ports. There is also now the ability with the K series NVRs to actually use the AccuSense IP cameras. So these are now fully integrated into the K series NVRs. So when you go into the VCA configuration, you actually have the AccuSense options. As long as it's an AccuSense IP camera, it will ask you whether or not you want to select it to the target detection to be human and or vehicle. It'll actually give you that live on the actual screen itself when you're configuring the system. So there's no need to log into the web front end of the camera itself for the configuration. It could actually all be done through the user interface on the actual NVR itself, and this has been available for quite some time on the I series, but they've also rolled it into the K series on the newer EUI 4 firmwares. And for anyone that hasn't used the newer EUI 4, I've just got a quick video of the actual local user interface, because it's difficult to do on a live webinar to see the actual local interface of the actual NVR itself, but I do have a quick video showing this and the benefits of the actual new firmware. That was just a quick video of the local interface on the newer K-series NVR firmwares. So there's now the ability to have an easy and an expert mode. So the easy mode would be for use after the installation, and it will also take away some of the menu options that engineers would use to actually configure the system. So a lot of people, it would default to easy mode when you first set up the unit. So to get into more of the advanced settings on the actual NVR itself, you need to click on the expert mode to switch it over, and then you can get access to some of the more in-depth settings that you're used to with the standard firmwares, or should I say the older firmwares for the recorders. There's also now a 4G NVR that's available in the K-series. This is up to a 16-channel unit. So this is something that a lot of people have asked for over the years, where they have a remote site that doesn't have a hardline internet connection, but the site needs to have CCTV surveillance, whether it be a construction site or anything like that. Hikvision have now released a 4G NVR, which will take a 4G SIM card in the back of the unit, and that will actually connect to the 4G networks here in the UK. There's a 4G antenna connection on the back of the NVR itself, and in the box it will come with the antenna for the unit, so that can be mounted in an area where it'll actually be able to connect to the 4G masts for the network connection. This would allow you to be able to remotely access the system via HiConnect and also via the IVMS 4200 software by logging into the HiConnect account. Now with this, you can also use it as a standard NVR via the network connection, but if you're putting a 4G SIM card in the unit, it would prioritise the 4G connection on that at the moment. And this is perfect for remote installs or installations where they're just temporary installs, where you just need a temporary system on site, for the example, a building site, or if there's no actual internet access on site or the internet often drops out, a 4G connection may be more reliable for that site, and this is the perfect kind of solution in those scenarios for the systems. And with this, there's no need for a fixed internet connection on site. And there's also SMS connection as well. So you can then configure the NVR to send alerts if the unit goes offline, if a camera drops off, and those can be sent via SMS text messages, which we've demoed in one of the YouTube videos that we've done covering the 4G NVR, which I'll send a link out when I send the slides out to after this video as well. And these are available in up to a 16-channel K-series 4G NVR unit as well. And these all have the PoE ports on the back of the recorder, but you could also connect to them to a PoE switch. If you have some remote cameras that are further away on the site, you could use switches to bring those back to the 4G NVR. And the 4G NVR would then connect to your 4G network via the antenna that connects to the NVR, and then the antenna would then transmit the actual information across the internet, and that could be to IVMS, PC running IVMS or web browser in different locations across the actual 4G networks. So it makes it a really powerful solution when you're looking at remote sites that don't have fixed internet connections, or you're just looking at temporary installations. A 4G system is much easier to set up than it is trying to get broadband or direct internet access to a site that's only going to be a temporary install. So that the 4G NVRs have been really popular in these kind of scenarios as a system. And they are really easy to set up as well. We've done our own quick start guides for setting up the 4G NVRs, which we can send over if you purchase those from ourselves as well. We then also got the I-Series NVR range. So these are predominantly aimed at your larger installs where you need high bandwidth capabilities. It's for example, using 4K cameras, and you're using a lot of those and you want to use them at the higher frame rates. Those can be above the limitations of the K series MVRs based on the bandwidth limitations of the actual units. With the I series MVRs, they have a higher bandwidth capability than the K series, so they can handle higher bit rates coming in from cameras and more of those cameras as well. And there's also an I series MVR which has 24 PoE ports on the back of the unit. There's also units that have dual LAN cards. If you want to run your own or create your own separate camera network using PoE switches, you could run that on your second LAN, and then LAN 1 could be your connection to the local network on site for internet access or remotely accessing the actual system. There are then large units beyond that called super NVRs, and these generally have 4 NIC cards in them, so it'd be 4 LAN ports on the back of the MVR, so you can split your cameras across the 4 different LANs, and these can go all the way up to 256 channels per super NVR, and on your really large scale commercial grade kind of systems. There's also the ability for more physical alarm inputs and outputs on the back of the I series MVRs, and you can also use an alarm expander module which can be wired into the I series MVRs to expand that even more, so you have even more alarm inputs on the back of the unit as well as the outputs. And there is also the ability to have a one-key disarm function. So if you have an alarm panel on site, you could take an alarm output from that panel, wire it into input 1 on the MVR, and that can then be configured so that when the alarm is set on site, it arms the actual NVR. And if you have any events set up, those will trigger through to the app or via email. And then once the alarm system's disarmed on site, the unit won't send those events through. So this is perfect for monitored sites when you're using monitoring stations, instead of relying on schedules for your arming and disarming. With the I series, it has the one-key disarm function ability, and which you can enable on the alarm input 1 on the MVR itself for the actual system there. So what are the actual benefits of IP versus TVI technology? So with IP cameras, you've got the ability to use what's called the ANR function, or automatic network replenishment. Now this uses an SD card installed in the camera itself, which would need to be purchased separately. So what would happen once the ANR function's enabled is, if for whatever reason the connection between the camera and NVR was lost, so long as the camera is still powered up, it would automatically start recording to the SD card that's in the camera. And then once the actual network connection is restored between the camera and the MVR, the camera will automatically dump all that footage from the SD card back to the hard drives on the MVR. And this is perfect for use when you're using wireless transmission. If for whatever reason the wireless transmitters go down, or the the wireless connection drops out, or even when you have remote cameras that you're adding via the internet, if for whatever reason that connection ever drops out, with the ANR function, you can configure it so that the camera automatically records that SD card, and once the connection is restored, the information is then sent to the recorder, and it's then recorded to the HDDs in the actual recorder itself. With IP as well, you also get the ability to use just a single cable, predominantly on PoE cameras, with a camera that supports audio, input and output, alarms, input and output as well. Some cameras actually do have the ability to have a 12-volt power output from the camera if you want to power a low power device, such as a physical detector, and also the data, all down one single Cat5 cable. Now there is of course the POC TVI cameras, which are power over coax for your TVI solutions, but those don't also send audio and alarms down them. That is only on the IP range that are capable of doing that. With the IP cameras, you can also remotely configure them via the web front end, so you don't need to go local to where the camera is to make any adjustments to the image settings or to adjust the actual zoom ratio if you've got a zoom lens camera or focus it. You can use the laptop connected to the same network as the camera, log into the camera's IP address and configure those settings, especially in the current weather and in the current restrictions. You could do that anywhere in the world as long as you have access to that camera via the network. So if it was remote, you'd need to port forward the site, but if you could connect to that network locally, you just enter that IP address in on your PC. With the IP range as well, you've also got the ability for ANPR cameras, which is a specific IP camera that's designed for number plate recognition. And this is something that we do get asked for quite a lot, where people are using barriers or they want to use it as a surveillance tool so they can see if any damage has been done. They can search back for any vehicles that have entered the area using the actual ANPR cameras, and also using it for the likes of parking management solutions, which are all possible using the Hikvision IP cameras. And events can also be set up from those ANPR cameras as well. So if specific plates are detected, those can actually be configured to send specific events depending on the need of the actual site itself. Also with the IP PEZ range, you can have VCA event triggered smart tracking, which I am going to do a live demo of on this webinar, where you can set up a line crossing line on the actual VCA rules, and you can configure it so if a person triggers that line crossing, the PEZ will actually track their movements automatically, which we're going to see in the next 5 minutes. And also with the IP cameras, they are less susceptible to interference. So I'm sure we've all seen before on analog and TVI systems where there's been interference caused by power that are running alongside the cables if they're not shielded, or on poorer grade quality coax, where you get interference on the actual camera images and stuff like that. With IP cameras, because the actual information is sent, is data that's sent, not an actual video signal, these are less susceptible to those types of interference. So those are generally easier to use on sites that are susceptible to those kind of issues. Now, before we get on to the live demo of some of the systems, I just wanted to make some recommendations for kind of useful tools for installs, especially for IP equipment. Always with the network cable testers, even myself, I've made plenty of cables. The one cable that you don't use on a cable tester is the one where there's a core missing or it hasn't crimped properly, and by the time you've wired it in, you then take it back out and redo the actual ends on the cable, whereas testing it before with network cable tester saves that kind of extra time further down the line. And something that we do always recommend to installers is to have a laptop, an engineering laptop, in case there are any issues, such as doing password resets through the SADP tool, remotely configuring devices, accessing the web front ends. The best tool that you can have is a laptop with a Ethernet connection, where you can actually connect to the network and be able to scan the network using SADP. If the camera's not showing up, or where you're needing to manually set the IP addresses of cameras, anything like that, a laptop is the best kind of testing tool that there is when it comes to IP systems, and in a lot of the cases TVI as well, because TVI recorders are usually connected to networks now. It's something that we do recommend for a lot of our installers. And of course, if there is an issue that we can't resolve over the phone, sometimes we may need to dial in, and we can dial in via TeamViewer on a laptop if there is a major issue where we need to actually dial in to try and resolve that issue for those as well. And another one is the network bandwidth calculator, or the disk calculator from Hikvision's online tools, which I will send a link out to as well after the webinar, which is perfect for calculating storage requirements, to check how large of storage size you need for an MVR to record for the number of days that the client's wanting, with the resolution and frame rates that they want to achieve on the cameras. It's a nice, easy way to see that and to be able to spec it correctly for the job. It also has the ability to show you the approximate bandwidth calculations. So, for example, if you had 4K cameras that you wanted to use on a K series MVR, their bandwidth limitations are around 40 megabits per second of incoming bandwidth. If you're running 4K cameras at 25 frames a second, 4 of them would be above that bandwidth limitation. But if you use the Hikvision tools, you can actually calculate that, and you can adjust the frame rates so you know how you need to set up that camera to be able to get the best possible images while being within the limitations of the actual MVR that you're using, or the network capabilities in some cases. On large networks, they may not have the availability within their actual bandwidth across their network to handle a lot of large streams going across the network. So in some cases, they might ask you to lower the actual bit rates of the cameras, and that can help you kind of work out the sweet point of bandwidth usage versus the actual camera image itself. Because if the bit rate's set too high, they can use a lot of bandwidth across the network, but that won't necessarily give you a better camera image because there's only so much there to actually send across the network. And if you're giving it a high bit rate when it's not needed, you're not actually going to see those benefits in the camera image if those bit rates are set higher than they need to be for the actual system. So there's just a couple of things I just wanted to mention there. So we can go on to some of our live demos. If I just switch my screens over. And I'll just refresh this to make sure we're on there. So this is the web front end of an I-series MVR, which has got a couple of cameras added to it via the network. So this is a 16 channel unit, and it's also got 16 PoE ports on the back of the recorder, which is noted by the 16p there. If it was the 24 port unit, it would say 24p. If it didn't have any PoE ports at all, there wouldn't be anything after the slash in the actual model number itself. So there's quite a few useful things now through the web front ends of the NVRs. So you can actually configure the local monitor outputs remotely through the web front end of the recorders. So you can see we've got the output port here. We can go HDMI, and we can actually change this layout. So I can go in and remove the cameras that I don't want to display there. And I can just have the bottom 3 rows displaying, or I can even change the actual view itself. So I can set it to a 4-way view for the HDMI output. I can also set it to automatically switch between the cameras as well. So currently it's set to no switch, but I can set it to switch the camera layout every 30 seconds. So it will switch through the cameras as a kind of scroll wheel. So every 30 seconds, it will switch out the cameras with new cameras on the system. And then I can then save that. And then on the local output of the actual monitor, it will now display those 4 cameras on the actual live view of the unit. And this makes it a lot easier when you're configuring it remotely, or as an engineer when a client's asking to be able to change the views or remotely change any of the settings that can be done through the web front end of the actual MVR itself. Now what we can do is we can go into the camera management page. So you can see on this MVR, we've got 2 tabs. We've got PoE channel and IP camera. So because this unit has PoE ports, we can go in and disable PoE PMP through there, which is the PoE bonding. But which would just turn off the plug and play by default across those channels. And then if I go into IP camera, this is giving us the list of cameras that could be added to the device. So we've got 16 channels, which are automatically generated because it's got 16 PoE ports on the back of the unit, which are all set to plug and play as default. But if we wanted to manually add a camera to the actual unit itself, we'd need to select the channel, click on modify, change the add-in method from plug and play to manual, and then we can manually enter the IP address of the camera that's connected to the network that we want to add, as well as the username and password, which you can see I've done there for those two cameras, and they're coming across the main network that we're currently connected to on site. So if now go into our video and audio settings, so these are slightly different than they are with TVI systems. So with a IP camera, they automatically give out a mainstream and a substream. The mainstream would be your high resolution, your kind of record resolution from the camera, and substreams generally aimed at use towards your live view, whether on the recorder locally or viewing remotely, because substreams are a low resolution and uses a low bandwidth. So it's more economical to use the actual substream for the live view than it is to use the mainstream of the actual camera image. So you can see our current resolution is set to 1080p. It's a 2 megapixel camera that we've got connected. I could lower that if I wanted to. I can change the frame rate. That's currently set to full frame, but I can actually drop that down, say if I wanted 12 frames a second, and I can also edit the bit rate through here as well. I'm going to leave that at full frame. And then we've also got video encoding. So originally with encoding it was H.264. There's now a newer updated version of encoding, which is H.265, which is a much more economical encoding technology that's used. So it actually uses less bandwidth and less storage space on the MVR. So where available, it should always be set to H.265. H.265 Plus is a more aggressive version of H.265. We generally don't recommend it if it's not a mainly still image. If you have people walking across or a lot of movement on screen and you have the H.265 Plus an option enabled, you can get a lot of artifacting around the actual movement on screen. That's due to the actual level of compression that H.265 is doing to the video. So we generally recommend staying at H.265, not H.265 Plus. So we can go in there and save that, which on this one is set differently. I've added this one from different NVR. So if we go into camera 2, I can then edit those as well. What we can also do is if we go to our stream type, you can see there it's currently set to mainstream. We can click on the drop down and we can go to substream. And these are your substream settings for the camera. So the resolution itself is a lot lower usually than your mainstream or your record resolution. This one's currently set to 640 by 360. A lot of people generally use 320 by 240, especially on sites that have low upload speeds on site. This allows them to be able to still stream the cameras remotely, but use a lot less of the upload speed on site, so you get more real time. There isn't going to be any bottlenecks caused by the limitations of the upload speed on the site that you're on with the actual system itself. We can then go into the image settings of the actual cameras, and if we go into OSD settings, we can edit the camera names, stuff like that, through the actual web front end of the MVR. And these camera names are then actually pushed to the IP cameras themselves, as saved on the IP cameras and encoded to the video by the IP camera itself for the actual system. Now, if I switch over to our PTZ. So I've got one of our PEZs that's mounted on the rear of our building, which you can see there. You can still see the frost on the ground at the back of our building. Fairly cold here in the northeast today. So if we go into the configuration page, I just wanted to run through some of the settings. So if we go into our system first. So this is the unit that we've got mounted outside the rear of our building. I just wanted to show you the event linkage for the smart tracking. So what I can do is if I go into event and then into our smart event, which is your smart events for the actual camera. So this could be line crossing, intrusion detection, face detection if the camera supports it. There's a whole swath of different analytics that are available depending on the model of camera that you're using. For this demo, we're just using a line crossing detection, which I'm just going to ask my colleague to get ready for now. So you can see we've got the line crossing drawn across the camera image there, and this is set to an A-B line. So either way the person walks through, it will actually trigger the line, and the target detection is set to human, and our sensitivity is set to 76. What we've also got in the linkage method is we've got the option for smart tracking, because this is a smart tracking PEZ. So when the line crossing is triggered, this will actually trigger the smart tracking functionality of the PEZ itself. So if we go to our live view, the actual camera, and my colleague's just making his way downstairs, you'll see in a moment he'll come out and he'll be in the bottom of the camera image. He's going to walk through the line, and the camera is actually going to track him as he moves around the outside of the building, and it will follow him as the actual analytics through the smart tracking algorithm for the PEZ, so there isn't a need to have an operator manually control and follow the person, which is perfect for surveillance on different sites as well. So he should be down there in a minute. And you can see there the camera's mapping him through the red area. It's triggered when the box turned red on the line crossing, and now the PEZ is using the smart tracking to actually follow him around the outside of the building there. He's going to walk back down, and the PEZ using the smart trackings trying to keep him in the actual frame of the actual camera, so it's keeping him in view at all times there on the actual camera. And it's going to follow him round. And then as he comes back into the building, PEZ then will stop smart tracking, and it will return back to its original preset where the actual line crossing is configured on the camera. So that's a really powerful option for the actual system. And it's a very usable feature when you're using surveillance systems that aren't necessarily monitored 24 hours a day, using the PEZ with the line crossing or intrusion zone with the smart tracking as the linkage method makes it a really powerful solution, and the perpetrators can then be followed by the PEZ on site, and you can go then set to actually follow them using the smart tracking functionality of the camera itself. And another thing that I wanted to show you, if I go into the web front end, actually I'll do it on this camera, go into configuration, and then go into our network advanced settings, and then go to email. So the PEZs and IP cameras themselves can be configured so that the devices or cameras themselves can actually send an email alert if any of the VCA events are triggered or specific events that you want the system to actually be triggered on. So if I enter in my details now, so this is just going to be outside PEZ or rear PEZ. Sender address is just going to be my email address. So with the SMTP details for email alerts, it's generally best to use the SMTP server details of the ISP on site. So it's especially if there's IT support, they'll usually have their own SMTP server details that they'd give you to enter into the camera for the camera to be able to send email alerts on the actual system itself. I'm just using the ones that we use for our system. And you can also say to attach an image. So when an event's triggered by the camera, it will attach an image from the event and send that through with the actual email as well. Retype the password and type it in right. And then we can then enter up to 3 different receiver email addresses. So this could be a monitoring station email address, or it could be the end user's email address, whoever needs to be able to receive the alerts when the event's triggered. So I'm just going to put now project email. So that's project. And then save that in there. So then when the actual camera actually triggers through, it will then send an email to the project inbox on there, which on this network, ours is set so it can't actually send emails out just for security. But in there, that's where the actual SMTP settings would be. And these need to match up for the SMTP server details for the site. Often with ISPs or internet providers, they will give you SMTP details for free that you can use as part of your internet package for the actual system there as well. I'll just swap back to my slides. Through. So that's just a quick demo of a few of the different systems there. What I'll do now is I'll go through the Q&As that have been put into the section on the Zoom. So if you have any questions, please go to the Q&A section and put those in now, and I'll start working my way through those. Or alternatively, you can drop me an email. My contact details are on the screen there. When you do leave the Zoom, you will be redirected to a feedback page. Any feedback that you could give us on this webinar would be greatly appreciated. We can use that to improve things and make improvements based on that feedback. The more feedback that we get, the better we can make our webinars going forward. We do have quite a few more scheduled for the next couple of months, so be sure to check out the webinar section on our website. And I'll start making my way through the Q&A section now. So Jarko's emailed asking, what kind of camera with microphone would you recommend for recording voice at a big concierge desk? So it depends on the actual room size when it comes to audio and the distance away from the camera. In some instances, it's easier to use the actual IP cameras with a built-in microphone. But if you're needing a camera where it's filtering out background noise, or you need a higher gain, then it may be that you need to use the separate soundboard that we sell. Or there's also the Hikvision microphones as well that can have an adjustment on the actual gain. With built-in microphones on some of the IP cameras, there's a gain slider when you log into the web front end of the camera, so you can actually adjust the gain of the microphone itself. Mike has asked, does TVI and IP AccuSense have the same accuracy for false alarm filtering? So they are now both on the newer Gen 2 AccuSense algorithms. The limitations with TVI is obviously that you can only have 4 channels of AccuSense technology on a DVR, whereas an MVR is dependent on you using AccuSense cameras. So if you had a 16-channel NVR, and you had 16 AccuSense IP cameras, all those could be set up with AccuSense analytics on the actual system. Anthony's asked, Gen 1 ColourView IP range, can they be upgraded to Gen 2 firmware which has AccuSense? So unfortunately with the Gen 1 generation versus the Gen 2, there has been hardware improvements, so they can't be upgraded to the newer Gen 2 analytics due to the hardware change, the actual cameras themselves. They have more processing capability for the more advanced algorithms that come with Generation 2 of those. Stephen has asked, is the 4K ColourView only available in bullet form? So at the moment it is only a bullet camera that's available in the 4K ColourView. I'm sure there's going to be a turret version released soon as well. Ikeem's put, hi, could you send me a recording of this session, please? So the webinar is recorded. It's usually uploaded to our YouTube channel around a week after the actual live session. For this one, we're aiming for the middle of next week to upload that for there. But if you follow our YouTube channel and turn on the notifications, you'll be notified as soon as this one's uploaded to our channel. Stephen's asked what length of cable on the 4G antenna. For the cable length, I'd need to double check for that one, Steve. I'll drop you an email after this webinar. I'll double check for you and I'll send you an email over with that. On the 4G recorder, does it have the AccuSense feature? Yeah, so with the 4G recorders, if you're using AccuSense cameras, it's still possible to use the AccuSense technology, but it'll be set up through the actual cameras themselves, but it can still trigger through from the actual 4G NVR. So it is possible to use those with that unit. Jarko's asked, are the recorders using TCP or UDP for RTSP? Real clients time viewing. So the recorders use TCP as standard across the board for the connections. Richard's asked, please confirm file size using the webinar email to me. So yeah, we'll be sending out the PDF version of all the slides after the webinar. I'll be sending some additional links for the Hikvision tools as well, which are really useful for those, but I'll send all those out in an email out to everyone at the end of the webinar for those. Lee's asked, are all K-series upgradable with EY4? So yeah, the K-series MVR, as long as it's an NI-K, those can be upgraded to the EY4 firmware, which is available on the Hikvision UK portal. There's a link to those on our website to take directly to them. So I think that's all the questions there. Any that I haven't been able to answer, please feel free to drop me an email. Any that I've missed out, I will run a report after the webinar just to make sure I've covered everyone's questions there. They don't always show up properly on Zoom, so I will answer those. But thank you for joining me today. When you end the webinar, you'll be redirected to a feedback page. I'd be really grateful if you could fill out that feedback form. It would be a big help and help us to improve webinars going forward. But thank you for joining me today. I hope you found the webinar useful and that you've enjoyed it. And I'll look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you. Bye.